Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick.
And I'm Alistair.
And this is a very straight-on format episode after two where we mixed it up a bit. Today we're dealing with David Brent's Life on the Road, the Office revival movie from Ricky Gervais, Cry Havoc, a military fantasy comic by Cy Spurrier, Ryan Kelly and others, and then we are finally looking back at Orange is the New Black Season 4, and then we'll be seeing what Alistair thought of Him and Her, BBC Three's slice of life sitcom that I recommended him in the last episode. But before all that, and this is the exciting part as I have no idea what he might say, Alistair, what have you been enjoying in the last fortnight?
Recently I've been enjoying Between Two Thorns by Emma Newman. I haven't read any of her novels before and stuff, and this one is it's a sort of urban fantasy, I guess you'd say, sort of fantasy mystery. It's set in Bath. There's sort of several main characters. There's sort of an alternative magical mirror version of Bath called Aquae Suez, where a quite sort of controlling and authoritarian sort of Regency era society lives. And one of the main characters has sort of escaped from this, and she's kind of been pulled back into it. There's also a kidnapping and a mystery, and it's a pretty good novel. I'm enjoying it so far. It's the first of 5, I think.
Yeah, something like that. I've actually read, I think, the first 2 of those. They are very good fun.
Yeah, Emma Newman's a great writer. And also, I'm listening to the audiobook of the novel, and Emma Newman reads it herself, and she is really good at reading. It makes sense that she would read it herself, as she's obviously well known from the Tea and Jeopardy podcast.
I think she has a big sideline as a book narrator, actually. I think it's her main sort of job outside writing.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's also kind of similar to Cry Havoc in a sort of urban fantasy mythological way, which we'll be discussing later.
Yeah, there's certainly overlap there. Anyway, Nick, what have you been up to since the last episode?
Well, I finished Season 1 of Outcast, which we discussed the first couple of episodes of back in, I think, MFV 10, the one where we discussed 3 different TV shows beginning with O. As a whole, it was quite a slow season at times, but the last couple of episodes were amazing. I'll give them that. The last episode in particular, but in general, the final couple did throw in a couple of really big twists and really amp up the tension. As I think we said when we first covered it, Outcast is quite focused on the atmospherics. It's very slow, here's a moody shot of a table. But it does put its main characters, Kyle, the angsty young man, and Philip Glenister, the priest, Anderson, that's the name, Reverend Anderson, the priest, played by Philip Glenister, through the ringer. It was good in the end. It was suitably depressing. Oh. And also, they bring in the villain, this guy who might be the devil, played by Data from The Next Generation, which is quite fun.
Oh, he's got a sideline now as playing villains in TV shows. He played a villain in Warehouse 13.
I didn't actually realise he'd done a lot of villains, but he does do a very good sinister face, so it doesn't entirely surprise me.
Well, he's done 2 villains, but he is good. You're right, he is very good at being villains.
Yeah, I don't know, I guess he was playing a cold, emotionless robot. It's only a small step from there to full-on baddie. But yeah, it did end on a sort of semi-ambiguous note, and considering I think they were renewed for Season 2 before it even started, then I guess they knew they were coming back, so why not?
First up this week, we'll be looking at David Brent, Life on the Road. Ricky Gervais has reprised David Brent, the character from The Office that first made him famous, 15 years after the original show aired. Brent is now a bathrooms products salesman, living in Slough and dreaming of being a rock star. He hires a bunch of session musicians to form a band and takes them on a tour of Berkshire that is fraught with failure, disappointment and awkwardness. If you're familiar with the humour of The Office, the BBC sitcom, this is in a similar vein, just more music. It did make me laugh. I thought it was quite funny. Nick, what did you think?
Yeah, as you say, in terms of is it a comedy, did it make me laugh, then yes, I did laugh throughout I was a bit worried Ricky Gervais might have lost the edge for properly grim, this is awful cringe comedy, because I watched about half of Derek and it was not much like that. But basically about almost all the film up to the ending, which the ending went a bit weird, but I'll get onto that. Most of the film was just David Brent's being awful and people giving sort of the wide-eyed office look to cameras, which between the UK and US office is now, I think, pretty familiar. Michael Scott / David Brent says something a bit dubious, and then the long-suffering employee, especially if it's the Jim Halpert, Martin Freeman, Tim character, gives a sort of wide-eyed, amused yet horrified look to camera.
Yeah, they pretty much nailed that comic beat. They could cut to the audience and get a great kind of audience kind of what the fuck reaction.
Yeah, during most of David Brent's songs, especially some of the more... There were some songs which were funny because they were about nothing, here's a big, sweeping, romantic Springsteen Americana, but it's actually about Slough or driving down the road drinking coffee or something. And then there's the ones which are just horrendous, where David Brent tries to tackle being nice to disabled people or Native Americans.
Yeah, social issues.
With all the grace of a man trying to do pottery with a hammer. Yeah, that comic beat, as you say, they've pretty much got it. They had the comedian Doc Brown as Dom Johnson. Yeah, he was particularly good for that beat. He gives very good, wide-eyed, oh god, what's he doing? And to be fair, he was great in general. In what was not always that much screen time, he did manage to make that character seem pretty human and vaguely understand why he's got this strange affection for David Brent, yet also appreciate that he's awful most of the time.
Yeah, I think the bit I laughed most at the film is, I think it's the first pub gig they play, because they go on a tour, but basically all the places they play are like 4 miles from his house.
Yeah.
And but he hires a tour bus and everything to try and simulate a real rock tour. But it's like the first pub gig they're playing, and there's like sort of 6 people fairly dubious in the audience. And there's a brilliant bit when they just cut to the entrance and this couple walk in and they just kind of have this look and whisper briefly and then walk out as if kind of like, no, let's not go here. It's funny because I've done that before. Sometimes walk into a pub and there's like a terrible pub band on and you do a kind of, you look at your friend and like, nah, let's go downstairs. But they nailed that with a kind of like how sort of instantaneously repulsive. Well, not repulsive in a grotesque way, but just how so incredibly awkward David Brent is that he just repels people from his presence. And the only way he can get people to hang around with him is to pay them, basically.
Yeah, there was a bit where he basically has to pay his band to socialise with him because they all hate him, and it's grim. There's also a bit where he tries to pop into their dressing room for a matey pre-gig chat, which is absolutely toe-curling. I was cringing through my cinema seat at that point.
Yeah.
One of the worries, I think, for me at least, going into this film was that Ricky Gervais was bringing David Brent back in a very nostalgic, it's him, don't you love him way, and wouldn't be able to do this properly dark, properly unpleasant, no look, seriously, he's awful. I mean, yes, he's vaguely well-meaning, but he's still awful.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, is like he means well, David Brent. I mean, like, he's sort of relatable in the way that he dreams of musical success and fulfillment, like a lot of people do, and he works in a sort of a regular job, and he's not a prejudiced person, but he just doesn't get it. I know he just doesn't really understand how you're supposed to conduct yourself around other people. Even though he doesn't set out to offend people, he just gets everything so spectacularly wrong.
It didn't really shy you away from making you properly think, wow, motives aside, he's being a bit of a dick. Like,
there's a moment, probably the most cringeworthy moments in the whole film, when they play a song called "Please Don't Make Fun of the Disabled."
God.
And it's just in a small pub, and it's cringeworthy awkward because he's trying to, like, obviously, you can tell David Brent wants to, like, make a serious point to try and help people, through the power of music, but it's just cringeworthy awkward the way he goes about it in such a ham-fisted way. And then there's a bit when they kind of halfway through, they just cut to like a bloke in a wheelchair trying to sort of quietly drink a pint during this like awful spectacle. And at the end, David Brent just points at him and goes, "This one's for you," to a little guy or something like that. And
yeah,
it's easy to create a character that's just a horrible human being to the core, and that character would be dislikable and repellent, and things like that. A man filled with like hate and prejudice. But David Brent he wants to do good things, sort of in a selfish way. But he just doesn't really seem to understand other human beings.
That's kind of one of the ways in which this film has dated oddly, though. I mean, in the 15 years since The Office was on, one thing that has perhaps changed slightly in the culture is, or certainly in the more liberal end of culture, is the tolerance for people who are well-meaning but still offensive.
Yeah.
I mean, I wasn't heavily involved in liberal-type culture around when The Office was on. I was 15 and mostly heavily involved in Spider-Man. But it does feel like over the intervening 15 years, the level has drifted away from, well, at least he's trying, to this sort of trying is actually not helpful. It would probably be better if you didn't. You should have the self-awareness to realise that's awful.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point in how things have changed. And I think it's also changed in how they portray the character. In the original Office, he's kind of an annoyance to his colleagues, whereas in this one, there's more of a sense, he's actively enforcing prejudice and stereotypes. Like, even though he does a song about Native Americans, he does a song about Rastafarians, he does a song about the disabled. And the point being that even though he's trying to do good, he is still reinforcing negative stereotypes, so he is doing bad, even though his intentions are pure.
Yeah, there was a bit, it's one tiny bit, where the sympathetic woman back at his office, the one who eventually turns out to be a sort of love interest. I mean, it's mostly quite underplayed. It's not really a major part of the plot, but yeah, is talking to someone at the office about that she's worried about David Brent because the world isn't like it was back when he did The Office, and people just don't have time for people like him anymore. And I'm honestly not sure whether that is a profound point about how society has changed or just something Ricky Gervais wanted to say to amp up the drama. I don't know whether it is the idea that having someone like David Brent around the office has gone from being, a sort of tolerable bit of fun to, no, seriously, we take our jobs more seriously now. Things are worse now. Stop dicking around, you prick.
I think they were probably trying to make that point to some degree. I mean, I think it's interesting to show how, in 15 years, how much the presentation of the character and the humour has changed. Not just in... Because one thing I was worried when they were going to make this film, I thought if they just tried to do a film version of The Office, it would be terrible. So, and I'm glad that they've tried to do something different. Like, they put it, rather than being set in one place, it's on the road, it's got different locations, it's him trying to be a musician. So in that way, they move the character on, they move the humour on, which is good, keeps it fresh, stops it being stale. But also, it sort of starts and ends with him in his current day job, which is like a bathroom product salesman, for lavatory dispensers and towels and things like that.
Yeah.
And the way they present him in a work environment in this film is very different to how they present him in a work environment in the original TV show. That's partly because in the original show he was the boss. There was a degree to which most of the characters we do have to put up with him to a degree because he is the boss. And now it's more like he's just another salesman. His boss doesn't have much time for him. He says it's like having a 15-year-old in the office. And one of his colleagues sort of actively quite dislikes him, almost to the point of bullying him.
Well, the joke I always read with David Brent was that he's one of these guys who's become the boss, mostly by dint of just being there longest, and doesn't actually have that many management skills.
Yeah, I think you're right about that.
So, I mean, it does, I guess, in a depressing way, kind of makes sense that if he did leave that job, he would then struggle to get another management job if he can actually demonstrate the ability to manage people.
Yeah, I can't imagine he has a particularly strong CV.
No, probably not. I mean, I did feel it was a bit flabby round the middle, in the sense that they didn't... not just a joke about middle age. The middle bit was a bit of a series of sketches. A lot of the Life on the Road stuff was just, here's something that happened. It's not necessarily part of an ongoing building plot, it's just a funny couple of scenes on the theme of being on the road. I mean, a lot of it does help to build up certain ongoing storylines, like his band all hates him, his friend the rapper is much more talented than him, but a lot of it is just, here's a funny scene with David Brent. Like, there's a bit where he gets a tattoo, and that's quite a funny scene. I'm not going to describe it because I don't see much point in spoiling the joke, but he gets a tattoo in a funny way, and in a lot of films you would expect that to come into the plot later in some way, like for him to accidentally wear a short sleeve shirt or have his clothes taken off for some reason, and for his tattoo to then be a comedy beat down the line. But it's just, I mean, maybe this is just a cut they've made, but it's just never mentioned again. The tattoo bit is just a one-off sketch, and there's a lot of bits like that.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's part of my more broader criticism of the film is that the story isn't particularly strong, and it does lack tension. I mean, those scenes in the middle that you describe, they build up the humour and they sort of contribute to the sort of character arc of the film. But there's no real sense of tension. There's no sort of conflict.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's meant to be elements of tension, sort of the escalating hostility towards David Brent from his co-workers, his band, I guess, the band he's hired. The sort of escalating fact that he's spending all his money on this and it's just running out. But until they try and bring that in quite subtly towards the end, that doesn't really feel like a major thing that's bubbling under throughout the film.
I felt that, the story could have been stronger. And it does kind of switch gears quite suddenly at the end. So it goes in one direction, which is basically every scene is played for, this is going badly, look how incredibly awkward David Brent is. And then it kind of sort of travels in that direction and makes a sudden sort of sea change to basically being, actually, he's an all right guy. People sort of do like him a bit. He's all right. And, then there's like a kind of warm, glowing ending. And I like the fact they went for the warm ending. I do think they're like comedy films, TV shows and stuff work well when they have a nice little kind of bit of warmth at the end, because that kind of gives you a really good feeling at the end of a comedy. So I like that they went for that, but it was a very sudden kind of, it went pretty much entirely in one direction with no tension and then switched and resolved itself.
Yeah, the ending was the one part of this film where I did remember I was watching something by the man who brought us Derek, because the sudden switch, just inspiring music and talking heads doing platitudes about the lead character, was very, very Derek. It's a shame because the rest of the film, apart from a few slightly over-expository talking heads, wasn't really that Derek, but the ending, yes, a bit Derek. And yeah, I guess, I mean, the ending was, as you say, it was weird because it was so sudden. It was also weird because, as I say, if we're talking about whether David Brent is sympathetic, and the idea that maybe he's less sympathetic now than he was in the early 2000s because we're less tolerant towards people who are well-meaning but still offensive. But even in the 2000s, he had some sort of resolution to that side of his character. Like, if you're doing a story about a character who is being horrible, you generally have to either have them realise it and redeem themselves slightly, or get their punishment for it. And at the end of The Office, they clearly realised this, because he did redeem himself slightly by telling his mate Finchy to stop being such a dick.
He also got punished by, he lost his job, which is clearly the one thing in his life that he really cared about or kind of defined him as a person.
Yeah, and whereas in this film, he's a dick. I mean, at times he's properly a dick. Like, the bit, like, just before that ending, there's a bit where his mate Dom has some mild success in the music career, you know, a big possible break. And he basically goes over to David Brent, and that's clearly the moment where he's supposed to go, yeah, really happy for you, mate, and instead he's basically incredibly jealous and stroppy. And
yeah, well, that's a really rude thing to do to someone.
It is a really rude thing to do to someone, and honestly, that's the fact that is one of the last major beats in the film. Like, literally, before that, it goes almost straight from that into the sort of redemptive ending. And it's just odd. I mean, they could have had David Brent rise above his feelings and be nice to Dom, and that could actually have been his redemptive ending moment. But instead, they pushed the he's a prick thing to about as far as they could, and then had everyone go, actually, he's all right, really. It just felt like letting the character off the hook in quite a lazy way without really doing anything.
Yeah, I think you're right. It would have been better if David Brent found redemption through kind of realising that he didn't have to be a success, but, you know, it's great that his friend who's found success.
But they just try and have that beat at the end. It's just a bit weird, but it didn't really happen until after everyone had decided he was a nice chap, which seems to make it a bit too easy for him. They could at least have included a bit where he realises his mistake and goes and finds Dom and apologises to him, but even that didn't really happen.
It's a strange question about how sympathetic we're supposed to be to Brent, because, you know, it's something I've been thinking about since I saw the film, and it is, you know, if it's intentional, it does walk quite a good line of making him both somewhat sympathetic and unsympathetic. I mean, we said he means well, he's got human desires and fallibilities, he ultimately wants to be liked, as well as he wants success in terms of being a musician, and, you know, we all want success, you know, fame in some ways, at least a lot of people do, but he also, you know, he has this really human desire just to be liked and accepted, and he's an awkward person, you know, and he's on some level aware of how disliked he is, you know, and all those are very human, very sympathetic qualities. They've given him a sort of workplace bully that picks on him in a sort of, you know, even though Brent can be annoying, this guy picks on him in quite a macho, unpleasant way, which, you know, makes you feel sorry for Brent. But on the other hand, all of his own problems are kind of his own creation, in that he just really doesn't understand people, but not in a way that he can't understand people, that he's kind of almost like he deliberately ignores people. That's why he's so awkward, is that he doesn't actually really think about anyone else. He's not like a sort of a social or emotional thing with David Brent. It's not that he's got, you know, Asperger's or some kind of mental health thing. It's more that he's just ignores other people. That's why he doesn't get them. You know, and he doesn't really learn, you know, anything from any of his bad experiences, and he's quite needy. So he's in some ways very sympathetic and very unsympathetic.
I mean, there are bits of it you could make to work. I kind of bought the beat where the sort of slightly grumpy manager develops this sort of vague affection, maybe not affection, pity might be the word, sort of takes pity on him as a childlike idiot who's ruining his own life.
Yeah.
The bit where they had built that into a I like you, David moment was a bit much, but I can understand that guy taking pity on him.
It's quite well done. I think that I was thinking back on it, that you do kind of see throughout the film is their sort of tour manager, roadie type person. He is kind of looking out for David Brent in the way that when David Brent's in the middle of one of his really awkward monologues, you know, on stage, just kind of saying something horrendous, just generally creeping out the audience. And he's the one guy who says, like, just play the song. You know, he interrupts. And thinking about at the time, that comes across as him just basically being really angry at Brent for Brent being a bit of a dick. Yeah. But looking back on it, that's actually that guy trying to help David Brent out, you know, trying to be a friend by saying, you're embarrassing yourself, stop it.
Yeah,
you know?
You're right, actually. I honestly hadn't got to thinking of it that way, but I think that is probably what they were going for, and that's actually, which is why, again, I think that beat did work. But yeah, I just felt if that went a bit far all in, which again comes back to whether perhaps Ricky Gervais's own liking of this character, he's sort of slightly putting that before the audiences and not giving us the mechanism to quite understand why he's now been redeemed, because we haven't actually seen him do anything redemption-worthy.
No, that's a good point.
And of course, ever since this film was announced, there's always been the greater question of, does this need to exist? Will this film be good enough or interesting enough or new enough to justify exhuming this character? And to be honest, it probably isn't. Although, if you're going to make another David Brent film, this is nowhere near the worst it could have been. This is all right. This is mostly quite funny.
It could have been a lot worse. And also, they have progressed the character. They've made the situation different. They've reflected how society has changed in the last 15 years in a subtle way, but it is there. And they made it this, the location and things like that, and the kind of the structure sufficiently different. Like the whole edition of the songs. I mean, there was like, I think once he played the guitar in the original Office. No, but the whole edition of the songs are, that's a whole new sort of comedic take on David Brent. It is fresh. It is interesting. Ricky Gervais actually has a pretty good singing voice, which I didn't expect.
Yeah, the songs are good. The songs, I was worried that the songs would be a particularly awful, embarrassing bit where they would cut to basically a 4-minute music video all the time. But no, they just play a minute or two of each one just to get the joke across, and then they stop it. It's mostly played pretty well, I think.
What I like about the songs, and this is something that Ricky Gervais and Doc Brown have said in interviews, is that they could have just written straightforward comedy songs, like Monty Python, songs that are just funny. But they wanted to be songs that were believable coming from those characters, especially David Brent. So they're funny because they're in character, they're not funny in isolation. I mean, he's written an Americana Springsteen-esque song about, kind of slough, and he's written songs about driving across America, despite the fact David Brent's clearly never been to America. He's never been much outside Berkshire, and it's all very in character. There was one bit of the film which I'm not sure if it really works at all, and it was actually, I felt a bit distasteful, was the scene when he takes the two women back to his hotel room.
Yeah.
And then he takes these two women back to the hotel room, ostensibly because he's a rock star, he's on tour, he wants some sort of sex with fans, although he doesn't have any fans. And they kind of raid his minibar and stuff. And I was watching this scene and goes is this scene funny because he's basically taken two overweight women back to his room, and now is kind of David Brent is a bit disgusted with them and doesn't really want to get off with them, but sort of does. Is this just a joke about fat people?
Yeah, it basically was, I think. I mean, to be honest, the joke about David Brent being disgusted with them as part of David Brent's general unpleasantness, I could have sort of bought. The bit where they ate a load of chocolate and there were constant sort of horror shots of the amount of chocolate vapors was just a bit, okay, fine.
Yeah, and lots of
overweight
jokes.
People eating chocolate to Lollacopter.
Yeah, I felt that, I know, considering that crossed over to generally something I thought was also basically a bit offensive, that this is just look at the funny
exactly.
fat
I mean, the David Brent sings a ridiculous song about Native Americans. I think the joke is basically entirely on David Brent, isn't it?
Yeah, pretty much. But during the Native American bit, or the when he sings a song about the disabled, or where he sings the song about the Rasta, it's supposed to be on how much David Brent doesn't get it. Whereas on that's kind of a reversal. David Brent's sort of on the side of the audience, supposedly in this scene, going my God, what's wrong with these people? They just stuff their face with food all the time. And that's not a particularly A, funny, or B, pleasant comic beat.
I can see how the bit he wanted to do, where David Brent wants to take some women back to his room and have a substance-fueled orgy, and it sort of happens in this really not what he imagined way, and it just serves as another part of his disastrous tour humiliation, but yeah. Okay, next we'll be talking about Cry Havoc, a recent series from Image Comics, written by Simon Spurrier, drawn by Ryan Kelly, and with colours by Nick Velarde, Lee Luffridge and Matt Wilson, and it's lettered by Simon Boland and designed by Emma Price. And yes, there are 3 colourists, it's part of the creative process, different colourists for different scenes, we'll talk about that later. Anyway, Cry Havoc is a military mythology urban fantasy series about a young woman who finds herself infected with a folklore monster and then recruited into a military unit of other folklore monsters, and then they go off to Afghanistan to confront something quite odd. This series actually came out mostly across the first half of this year. The collected edition of the first 6-issue storyline came out a couple of weeks back. Simon Spurrier actually did a post on his blog talking about how pop culture journalism, especially comics journalism, often gets a bit focused on the new launches and never actually, it covers the first issue or 2 of a new series and then never bothers to go back and see how the story finished, which is kind of relevant since most comics nowadays tend to tell stories that take 4, 5, 6 issues to finish. So yeah, we thought we'd take him up on that challenge and go back and look at the completion of Volume 1 of Cry Havoc, which, brilliantly, because I love a good pun, is called Mything in Action. Okay, so, Alistair, you've read Cry Havoc Volume 1. What did you think?
Yeah, it was very good. Really engaging comic. I think now I've read a few after the ones you've been recommending or we've been covering for this podcast. I've got more into reading comics and kind of, got more experience at it, so I'm enjoying it more. And this one kind of really did grab me right from the beginning. Partly because it's got such a good main character. There's some very good characters in this, but the main character especially is really a really great, engaging, reluctant hero. An ordinary person, very human, fallible. She gets sucked into this through no fault of her own, into this kind of unusual world and has to survive there. Yeah, so great main character, really swept you into the stories. It's kind of a strange thing because it's structured around 3 non-linear stories. So rather than a sort of straight linear progression from the first chronological event to the last one, you kind of get 3 sections of the story sort of running parallel to each other. And at some points, sort of going back and forth between them. So it's a very sort of classic non-linear storytelling structure. But even despite that, it was quite easy to follow what was going on, partly because they had 3 colorists, so you could tell by the colour which of the 3 stories you were in.
I think it was obviously an attempt to indicate it via palette. Like, basically the 3 sections were the beginning, middle and end, sort of her at home in London, her with this unit in Afghanistan, and at the end where she's, I don't know, I guess we always shouldn't spoil it too much, but yeah, at the end when she's very much amongst the enemy. So yeah, they're sort of coloured blue, sort of sandy yellow and red.
It helps you tell exactly where you are and stuff. And there's the transitions are handled well, so you can tell when you move from one storyline to another. I think, as I've said before, the thing about comics, because each separate image or piece of story takes place in a panel that's isolated from the others. Between every single piece of every scene, there's always a transition, which means that you can do creative things with, placing the next panel in the sequence, not necessarily be the next event linearly in the story, which in film is more difficult, film and TV, because film moves continuously through a scene and then has more abrupt transitions. So you're making a more obvious departure if you present film in a non-linear fashion. But yeah, this is, it's also just a great story. It's well written.
Yeah, I liked this is something that happens in a lot of Si Spurrier's work, and there's at least a couple of things I may recommend to you in the future in our recommendations section. But yeah, the sort of very on the nose involvement of metaphor in the story, like it's about old sort of myths trying to get back into real world relevancy.
It's a strange plot, but it's well done.
It's very well done, and it may not be for everyone. The sort of on the nose. Here are some concepts actualised and then actually used in the plots.
I like the fact they didn't go for sort of established mythological characters. Like, it wasn't your obvious crop of Hollywood creature features. Like, the main character, she's a were hyena. She's bitten by a sort of a hyena type thing and transforms into some kind of. So she's not. You could have been obvious to make her a werewolf, but actually no, she's a.
Was she supposed to be a were hyena? I don't know. I to be fair, it's possible I just missed a line of dialogue. I just got it as a general big black dog wolf thing.
I thought it was supposed to be a hyena, but maybe I misunderstood it.
They did frontline those hyenas quite heavily in the first issue.
Yeah, and one of the other characters is a sort of Malaysian vampire-esque character.
Oh god, yeah, that bit at the end was a heavy payoff. Yeah, I enjoyed that.
That was good. And again, they're going for characters from either different twists on the established folklore characters or going for unusual folklore characters from other cultures, rather than hitting the kind of the standard creature features you've seen before. There's no werewolves or vampires or zombies. It's they're doing something a bit different, which I like.
Yeah, and I read the individual 6 issues, but I just bought them on Comixology as they came out, and I don't know if these are in the collected edition, which I think you had. But yeah, they had the annotations at the back in which the writer talks a bit about the individual myths and where he got them from or what their significance is.
Yeah, that's there, but I think it's all 6 notes are all together at the end.
Oh, that makes sense, I guess. It would be a bit choppy to mix them in.
Yeah, we're going to go a little bit spoilery, but I'm going to try and not spoil it too much. So the first story chronologically is set in Hackney in London, about this hipster teenager, maybe sort of early 20s, I guess, who's a sort of musician, a bit of a tearaway. Her girlfriend is a zoologist and works at ZSL, I guess it is, looking after the hyenas. And she gets, bitten by some sort of supernatural creature and then doesn't really know what's going on, starts transforming, and then you see her life kind of disintegrate. And I thought that story was really well done. It showed, it was very human.
Yeah, her sort of extreme emotions, self-destructing thing, I thought, I mean, it's a beat you see a lot, I guess, in films and stuff. It was really well done. The bit where, her life starts to get back together and become conventional, and that's when she just can't stand it anymore, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and you're mirrored by her partner is very controlled, almost emotionally withdrawn. She's got a regular, very professional job. She's very focused on her work, whereas Lou, the main character, is she's sort of a casual musician. She plays violin in sort of various bands. She's sort of no real income, no real sort of prospects or job. She's more almost like a large teenager, and that's kind of exacerbated by she starts to transform. Although Lou's partner doesn't know about this, but Lou is bitten by this creature, starts to transform, and thus becomes more out of control, more destructive and stuff. And Lou's partner thinks it's part just her sort of teenager tearaway side, and it adds to the tensions that already exist in their relationship, and it kind of felt very natural, and like it was presented in a very believable way, so I really like that.
Yeah, and more broadly, I think the non-linear thing, sort of presenting the three stories together and having this sort of fairly relatable London-based relationship story happening all through the story alongside the sort of slightly more aggressively fantasy military stuff, I think did help provide it a bit of grounding and stop it becoming too, I don't know, lose its moorings and just become fantasy creatures biffing each other.
No, exactly. I think that's very good, having that sort of, that foundation. And also, partly because the stories are non-linear and they're sort of told together, each of the three individual stories does progress from a version of normality into a more chaotic version and then resolves itself. So even though the first story is London-based and just has Lou living her normal life, it moves to a chaotic version in that, when she's transforming into a werewolf or were-hyena and her life's falling apart, and then reaches some resolution at its end, which is when it connects up to the middle story. The middle story, which is set in Afghanistan and is a military story, has a similar structure in that it begins with normality, or for Afghanistan, in that it begins with what you think are just regular soldiers doing regular soldier stuff. It begins with so what is normality, moves through to chaos as the more supernatural element of their military unit becomes apparent, and again moves to a resolution which connects up to the third story, which also follows a similar structure. And I thought that was a great bit of writing. Very clever.
Possibly my favourite part was the London urban fantasy section, because I think that's just to my taste. But the way it all mirrored itself was good. I thought the art was lovely throughout, but I thought the Afghanistan section, the sort of sandy styling of the colouring did work really well for showcasing the sort of the creatures. Like, it's fairly carefully deployed throughout. I think certainly the first few issues, that every issue you get one of the fantasy creatures gets a sort of showcase bit.
Yeah.
A sort of big action moment where they come out. Like, I think certainly the first issue, it's basically Lou the werewolf, and then there's I'll again try not to be too spoilers, but there's a big pig guy, there's the aforementioned Malaysian vampire, there's others. And yeah, I thought in all cases the big reveal where Ryan Kelly gets to draw these monsters just going for it is really good. And really nicely coloured.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. The way that they depict the transformation is really well drawn, really well coloured. Like, the creatures, they're realised so well, and the transformations are shown so beautifully, and again, which makes it believable. And there's some very beautiful artwork in this, which is one of the things I think really helped it be engaging, how well drawn it is. And also, I just think the depiction of Afghanistan was really great, just like the constant shots of just the sort of gravelly, stony wasteland and kind of isolated, battered buildings and kind of emptiness. There was some poetic beauty in that. And the way he sort of depicted the kind of seedy but teeming of life, sort of Dalston nightlife. There's a few bars and stuff, and there was a bit that was blatantly set just outside Dalston Junction Station, where I'm quite regularly for my sins. And you could really tell it was the same corner, and it really had kind of captured what that place looks like on Friday night, with sort of people running around drunk and, sort of grabbing kebabs and stuff. And really great art, really great depiction.
Yeah, and plus, it really captures the emotion of things like the big kitchen sink domestic showdowns between Lou and her girlfriend. All the anger and the anguish, and yeah, it's all great.
Yeah, the army story I thought was very good. In that, it had real tension, didn't fall into a load of military movie cliches.
I think, as often happens in these sort of interesting genre blending stories, the free fall at the end, it always seems like the least interesting part. So it's kind of disappointing when all the plot building stops and the big fight takes over. But they do include quite a lot of big reveals calling back to the previous parts, and it is quite a carefully choreographed final fight in the last chapter. So it's definitely among the better examples of that, I think.
The one thing I didn't like so much about it was the final of the three stories. I wasn't so much of a fan of. I don't want to spoil it too much for readers, but I did feel that the third story, which is mainly focused around a confrontation between Lou and the story's main villain, it was very dialogue heavy. It didn't have much action, but it didn't have much conflict as opposed to it had big action bits. So a lot of it didn't have a lot of conflict. It was very dialogue heavy, and there was quite a lot of pretentious talking about myths and zeitgeist and stuff, some which is necessary to fill in the context, but I did feel it was, at that point, possibly overwritten, and it did make me feel a bit like, I don't know, this is a bit heavy on the whole flowery exposition language.
It was a bit villainous speech explaining plot, I guess. I mean, I think obviously that's necessary because the main role of that section, in a way, is to explain the plot, and but I guess if they're considering how much they're talking about stories and their role in stories, that is the main antagonist falling into her role in the story. But yeah, I mean, I think, as often happens, the big ending mashup is often the least interesting bit, and the ending sequence, the red-coloured section, did have to bear the brunt of a lot of exposition.
Yeah.
Although it did get going a lot in the last couple of episodes, obviously, when the rest of the story caught up with it and then stuff went down.
Yeah, no, it definitely got shifted gears at the end and got a lot better. But I did feel that considering how well written the first two stories were, that one I did feel was weaker. Like, considering when in the first story, the whole sort of exposition of her sort of being bitten and becoming the kind of the monster thing, that was handled very well, and kind of the sort of explanation was drip-fed properly and stuff, and it sort of made sense, whereas the final one was more of just a kind of talking to camera in a slightly unnatural way. So I know it's just a shame when something so well written does kind of fall down a bit at the end.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I read this twice because it was quite dense and I wanted to make sure I actually understood it. And there were bits which, to be honest, the first time I read it, I didn't read his annotations because I don't know, because I guess I wanted to have a more pure, straight-through experience somehow. But yeah, there are parts of it I genuinely didn't pick up on until I read it through the second time with the annotations. Some of which were quite plot relevant, like the significance of the women in burqas.
Yeah, that was something that took me a while to pick up on.
It does sometimes move quite fast through story beats, or expect you to have a degree of paying attention to things in the background of panels and stuff, which possibly I just have got into the habit of reading comics a bit too fast to fully comprehend.
It does put a lot of story into only 6 issues, so I think it is quite densely written, and one of the reasons it's very well written is it managed to cover this story really well, in quite a complex story with quite a lot of characters in a short period of time. I'm sure it stands up to a read very well. Yeah,
there's a lot more layers you can discover there, and a lot more details about the various creatures. As I say, I was a pre-existing fan of Simon Spurrier's work, but yeah, I thought this did actually live up to my expectations. This was really good. The art was absolutely lovely. I don't think I've read anything drawn by Ryan Kelly before, and yeah,
he was very good.
He's got some stuff coming up next year. I think a series with Paul Cornell and possibly more Cry Havoc. I will try and check out both of those.
Yeah, that sounds good. I remember from the comics panel at Nine Worlds, and regular listeners, if they think back to the last episode, they'll probably know what I'm talking about. There's a really good comics panel about hope in comics, and one thing they said was, how good a lot of the stuff coming out of Image Comics right now is, and saying that they're really putting out a lot of great stuff. And, I can see why, if they're putting out stories of the caliber of Cry Havoc. Next up, we'll be discussing the 4th series of Orange is the New Black. We looked at the first few episodes way back in episode 10 of the podcast, and now we're going to be doing the whole series, and I can imagine we'll be sort of heavy on the spoilers, so if you've not seen the whole series, and I do recommend watching it spoiler-free, skip over this section. But yeah, in this series there are new inmates and new guards at Litchfield Penitentiary, and they're under new management, and now they're owned by a sort of a private company. There's a lot of new characters, there's quite a lot of new drama as well. I liked this series quite a lot. It ramped up the tension from the last one. Nick, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, big fan. This was basically like the sort of dark half of Season 3. I don't know whether there was some meeting after Season 3 got kind of a bit criticised for being a bit uneventful, and they thought, right, okay, fuck it, let's make it properly dark and depressing now. Or whether there was an epic 2-year master plan, and the first half was just the slightly dull setup before everything just went to hell this year. But either way, good outcome. Bravo.
I can imagine it's probably the former of those two suggestions, isn't it?
You think there was a meeting?
I think there was a lot of criticism of Series 3 for not being as dramatic. And I know, I kind of liked Series 3 being a bit more sedate and stuff, and, trying to remind you the fact that this is a minimum security prison, there's not as much, sort of violence, and they're not trying to do Oz just with an all-female cast.
I think a bit of sedate is fine. I think a few episodes of sedate is fine. I think 13 episodes of sedate was possibly a bit much.
Yeah, but this one they did certainly ramp up the tension. I mean, the first episode begins with Alex Vox has to kill a guard who's actually a hitman that's been sent in to kill her, and she's pretty messed up by, what she's done. There's the formation of gangs in the prison. New prisoners are introduced, including some quite scary ones, including some neo-Nazis stroke white supremacists. Tensions are mounting the prison. They've lost all their guards at the end of Series 3, so they have to recruit new ones, and they, to save money, recruit former soldiers who don't have much experience, and that situation escalates and becomes dangerous.
Yeah, generally something memorable and plot progressing and often quite dark happened in basically every episode. So yeah, it was a proper sense of shit going wrong, bad things being punished, I guess. There was a feeling that everyone who got to just sort of loll around doing what they wanted last year would then be duly punished for it this year. Especially Piper, it has to be said. Piper and her silly panties business. I don't know, the idea that she could be this sort of minor prison gangster and just play it for laughs did get quite badly beaten down in the first few episodes of this season.
Well, because she started this kind of illicit prison panty business, and now the competition increases, and then people start to organise around the various competitions, and basically gangs form in the prison along racial lines because of this. And Chapman is, for her own selfish reasons, she started it. She didn't want it to get to the point when there's kind of like, a white power gang in the prison. She doesn't know. Yeah. She didn't realise what she'd unleashed.
I know Chapman gets a lot of stick online. I kind of want to stick up for a bit. Perhaps not to the extent of I like her and want to be her friend, but I think she's a good character to have in it. I quite enjoy her sort of... At this point, they've stopped playing her as sort of the identifiable main character who you're meant to empathise with and be with all the time, and she's just become this sort of comical idiot who is still filtering her experience of actually being in prison through having watched, I don't know, as you say, probably Oz or something. The episode, which ends like with a sort of slow focus in on her face as she realises she's accidentally started a Nazi gang, was hilarious. Obviously awful and hilarious. When everyone around her is shouting "White Lives Matter" and she's just looking absolutely petrified.
That was a great ending to an episode. And then it plays out to "Tomorrow Belongs to Me," which was the official song of the German Nazi Party. That was a nice touch on the end.
Yeah, I don't know if Orange New Black gets enough credit for its choice of excellent and thematically appropriate end songs, but they're always so good.
They are very, very good.
It's annoying because Netflix being Netflix, and this being a show that's only on Netflix, will always cut the credits after about 10 seconds to try and make you watch the next one.
Yeah, but at least you get a good blast of someone yelling "Tomorrow Belongs to Me."
No, I always click on the credit box with my remote and make it play me the entire credits just so I can listen to whatever the song is that episode, because I just really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it is quite funny at times, as well as being pretty dark. In this series, they kept, speaking of Chapman, they kept up with something I really liked from the last series, which was that the strength of the show is the diversity and the huge range of characters they've got in it. And this series, like last series, has considerably less Chapman, considerably more of the supporting characters.
It's basically had less Chapman since about the start of season 2, hasn't it?
It's been a sort of just sliding decline.
It was very specific beats. At the start of season 2, the first episode of season 2, Chapman was off on her own. Like, literally, there's no one else in it but Chapman. I think Alex was in it for a few minutes. And then the second episode took place while Chapman was away and was only about all the other characters. I think then she got back in the next episode, and ever since then it's basically been a split, I think. I don't think he's really been the main character since then.
You got a lot more Tasty in this series. You got a lot more Pusey in this series. There was a major plot involving Sophia and characters trying to get her out of the shoe. You had a major Nikki plot, a major Alex plot.
It is always impressive how many characters they managed to have operational and in the air and moving at any one time. But I think obviously they do it in the same way all these shows do, by just not using everyone in every episode. They just choose, I think, 4 or 5 plots and move those ones forward, and then the next episode it's another 4 or 5 plots, some of which are different.
It must be a huge effort of planning, because all the points when the characters' plots intersect and how they bounce off each other, and the fact that it all contributes to creating a portrait of the same environment. It just must be so much planning to make it, because it does seem seamless how everything kind of fits together and works in the context of the prisons.
Well, yeah, I mean that's why that's why good shows in general are good, I suspect. The idea that it does feel like a machine rolling onwards in a correct, inevitable way, which is driven by the characters. Like, Alex kills this bloke and buries his body, then the prison gets privatised. As a result, Caputo is constantly out at meetings. As a result, this uppity new guard, Piscatella, starts to take over and usurp his authority. As a result, he tells them to just knock over that flower bed and to build something new, even though he probably shouldn't be doing that. And as a result, they find the body that Alex buried, and that's just one plot. Intersecting, but there's loads of stuff like that.
Ramps up the tensions in the scene, which leads to the really awful, heartbreaking moment. We've had a text in from regular listener Kirsty to say that series 4 had its heartbreaking moments, and I think she specifically means the scene right at the end of the penultimate episode, and that is again the culmination of the plot line that begins when Alex kills the guard. I don't know if we want to go into full spoiler territory at this point.
I think at this point it's been a few months and we've pretty much spoiled everything anyway. So Pusey dies.
Tragically and awfully.
Pusey dies in a really depressing, accidental way at the hands of a guard who is clearly more just unprepared to deal with a very slightly violent situation and doesn't quite realise his own strength and accidentally kills her, basically, and it's just all incredibly depressing.
Pusey is quite small and gentle.
And he's just basically leaning on her for about 30 seconds or something while he's trying to do something else with his other hand, and then he looks down and realises she's dead.
Yeah, the guards get increasingly heavy-handed, partly because they're inexperienced and don't really know how to handle things. The only experienced guard really is one who's from the Max facility, who's much tougher and wants to take a much harder line with the prisoners because he's used to working with prisoners in a maximum security prison, not a minimum security prison. And the guards get tougher, especially after they find a dead guard. They then became very aggressive to the prisoners. The prisoners stage a peaceful protest. There's sort of a small fight breaks out. It's so complicated. I don't want to describe it because it's so nuanced in loads of different ways. Because like Crazy Eyes has a bit of a breakdown, but that's related to a long-running plot with her that would take a long time to explain. So to give you the full context of what happens, I'd really recommend people watching it because it is a brilliant piece of writing. How all these little things and character dramas come together in this moment of kind of chaos and confusion, which leads to a horrible tragedy, but it's all kind of set up so well through all the different backstories of all the different characters running through the series.
Yeah, it is well set off. It is the payoff to an entire year worth of things getting continuously worse in the prison. But it is a story development that's drawn some controversy. There have been, partly because it's a lesbian character being killed off, and there have been quite a lot of those lately, I hear.
Yeah.
And partly because I think the death of a black woman at the hands of an authority figure in the middle of a protest is a slightly sensitive topic, I guess, at the moment in the face of Black Lives Matter and other stuff that's happening.
Yeah, which they do directly address the Black Lives Matter in the TV show. I mean, this series, I think more than previous ones, did seem to be willing to directly address social issues more head on. There was a lot of talk about in the show between the characters of race and representation. There's a bit when they in the sort of prison movie club they want to watch The Wiz. And because of the white power prisoners just try to disrupt this screening. And I know there is much more, I think, in this series, a direct discussion of contemporary political and social issues.
I don't know, I've seen criticism of the decision to spend a lot of the episode where she dies basically humanising the guard.
Yeah.
Is it Bailey, I think his name is? The guard who kills her, rather than, well, she gets her flashback in the next episode, and obviously has had them in previous seasons. Yeah, I mean, I think it's... Yeah, in isolation, I can see how it might be upsetting compared to things happening outside. I think it's understandable when you look at what Orange is New Black has been doing for the last 4 years, and indeed is doing this year, in that it's the system. It's just shit. It's not...
No one's responsible.
No one was responsible. But then again, that's sort of addressed in the last episode, when Caputo basically gets on camera and says something like that.
Yeah.
And then, funnily enough, does not placate the people who are upset about Poussey dying.
No. But I thought it was quite, I don't know, it's a complex and nuanced approach. I can see why it would draw criticism, and, I'm not saying anyone's criticism is invalid. In fact, any criticisms you have in the show are definitely valid. But I think what I did like about the show is the way they try to present everyone as a human being, that with human failings. And just because you have human failings and that leads to a death, that person is still responsible, and the sort of complex system of prejudices and privileges that contributed to Poussey's death are very valid. But it's really trying to show how complex the issue of incarceration in America is in the sort of small details and the sort of human nature of the characters. So I'm not saying anyone is offended by it. It's wrong to be offended by it. You are definitely right to be offended by it, and it's not perfect, and there's definitely strong criticisms, but I do like how they try to show nuance to the issue.
If I was going to criticise it from my privileged position as someone who's mostly interested in picking apart the actual writing, I think giving Poussey a storyline in her ultimately death series, which basically consisted of she's in a sweet uplifting relationship. Gosh, I hope nothing bad happens to her after her storyline for the entire season has been mostly positive. Oh, it's cheap. It is cheap writing in a way. It is sort of, look at her sweet relationship, oh shit, she's dead. It was not the most nuanced part of the season. Because they're good writers, the scenes where she was being sweet with So-So were very, very sweet, and it did, in a way, contribute to my sadness over her death, even though part of me would have liked to have seen more scenes playing up her friendship with Tasty, because that was a big part of her character in her final season. But, in a show which does often do some quite interesting, nuanced and thoughtful things, that was fairly dead straight.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. You're definitely right about, it could have been handled differently, and probably the fact that it's drawn criticism is probably because of the way it was handled by the writers. The new guards are again a complex thing. They're mostly army veterans. They're not equipped to deal with prison. There's some guards, especially, even the guard who ends up unfortunately killing Poussey isn't the worst of them. That doesn't excuse anything that he did, but some of them are deliberately vicious.
Yeah, obviously in order to try and play out the complexity, give that bit to the
naive one, yeah.
The naive, unprepared one, where rather than, I think there's one, is it Humphrey, who is like a proper terrifying sadist.
Yeah, he's controlling, manipulative, aggressive, violent, someone who shouldn't be given power over people, and completely neglects his duty of care. But it's trying to show, again, the complexities of the prison system and these issues, especially when you get private companies coming in. I mean, there's maybe viewing it through the lens of my own left-wing politics, my main interest being the politics of the economy, that I thought the big villain was, as MCC, the private prison firm, that, that basically when a guard dies, they're more interested in how best to play it from a corporate point of view. When a prisoner dies, they don't even want to call the police or get an ambulance in until they've worked out an angle that they can spin it on. And
I don't think you're reading much into the show to say that, no. I think MCC were largely played as villainous to an almost cartoonish degree.
The fact that, they were just obsessed with saving money and saving face, and pretty much everything that went wrong in some way can be traced back to them. Certainly the fact that they staffed the prison with guards who were untrained or had been moved away from other prison work because of having a bad record. And they saved money by overcrowding the prison.
Well, yeah, all that stuff about Caputo's love interest having never been in a prison before, and
they didn't really understand prisons.
That, what was it, that convention or expo they went to, where it was just hyped up ridiculous. Orange is the New Black's habit of occasionally throwing in some proper on-the-nose OTT satire alongside all this deadly serious, gritty prison drama it can sometimes be a bit jarring, but it does always make me laugh.
I think that episode did work, but they were certainly saying that private prisons have their flaws. There's a huge potential for things to go wrong. I know that this is also very timely because Mother Jones has published a huge, I think it was 30,000 words, maybe? I don't know, but a very big investigation into private prisons in America, which I think has actually led to now the US government is not going to continue using private prison firms, or at least the federal government is.
There's some nuance to that, isn't there? Certain types of private prison or fully privatised prisons are stopping, but there are others that are partly privatised or partnerships or something that are going to continue.
Yeah, but this does tie in. This is quite timely. I think that's fortuitous in the sense I don't think they didn't know this expose was going to be published around the time this came out. But it is timely that we're having a conversation about the involvement of private firms in prisons.
Well, yeah, and the show is, I believe, renewed up to season 7 or 8, so they'll definitely have time to incorporate that.
Yep.
And obviously, we've talked about, I think, some of the big, memorable beats. Other characters, Dyer getting the gun at the end was kind of...
Yeah, I'd say the final beat, which just ends, an actual riot breaks down the prison between the three main ethnic groups, the white, the black, and the Latinos, and it ends with one of the most sort of sadistic and out of control in the guards convinces his friends that he can bring a gun into the prison, and obviously one of the prisoners gets hold of the gun, and they end on a cliffhanger of the gun being pointed by a prisoner at a guard.
And it's Dyer, rather than one of the prisoners who've been directly involved in being... Because the guard who's at gunpoint is Humphrey, the most sadistic and awful of the guards. There are prisoners who'd been directly tortured by him who could have been given the gun, which does, on the one hand, it seems a bit random. On the other hand, it does add another element of uncertainty to it. I have no idea what she might do.
Yeah.
Of the new guards, I think at times Piscatella went into a bit too much of a textbook sadist villain, but I think that's just another time that Orange is the New Black can be very on the nose.
Yeah.
Yeah, I genuinely thought they were going to kill off Healy for a few minutes this season. I really did think maybe they have done everything they can with that character. Maybe it is time for him to go, even if him walking into the sea and killing himself would have been a bit depressing.
I think, yeah, Healy has kind of had his character arc. One of the things I do like about the show is that they do kind of, when a character's reached the end of that arc, they kind of let that character go, rather than feel the need to generate artificial extra drama for that character. So I think Healy has reached the end of his character arc. He didn't die, but he did check himself into a psychiatric institute, so he may not be back.
So that's a good point, actually. I kind of took he's not dead, so he'll probably be back from that, but maybe you're right. Maybe this is him just leaving the show in a slightly less depressing way.
I guess it may come down to whether the writers can think of what they want to do with him in the next series. If they can't think of anything, they can leave him in the institute.
But yeah, you're right. He doesn't have to come back, does he? Because yeah, I think they're very big on, we're going to explore the nuance and the motivations of all these characters, even the ones who are pretty unlikable or that you wouldn't really want to spend that much time with.
Yeah.
And they have explored Healy to some extent. He clearly isn't going to reform or change or become a massively better person, but he's had his day.
Yeah. My favourite character, I think, is still Red, the Russian cook, head of the kitchen.
I do kind of wish they'd give her another massive, major traumatizing plot, because at the moment I think she's just kind of there. But on the other hand, she's well written and well acted and good, so I have no problem with her as a presence. I just don't know if she's getting that much to do at the moment.
I think she's great how they linked her in with the body, this one, because being the fact that she had some connection to the Russian mafia, that she knows about body disposal, so, and she also knows about how to, keeping secrets, so she gets brought into the whole kind of we have to hide the corpse of a guard plotline.
Well, yeah, and she's the general sort of matriarch figure to most of the sort of the white section of the prison, so yeah, I guess she gets dragged into that.
Well, because in this plot, the white, partly because they introduce new characters, the white one kind of splits, and there's the kind of moderate white group that Red's the kind of leader of, that has, that includes Chapman and Alex and Nikki and some of the others whose names temporarily escape me. And then there's the really racist group made up of some of the new characters and some of the people who were the former followers of Pennsatucky, the people who were doing drugs, like doing crack and stuff in the prison before.
Yeah, the Pennsatucky story is odd.
That's a story which basically is about rape in prison. And I guess we should probably say that if anyone is triggered by any discussions with rape or sexual violence, maybe skip to the next section at this point, although we'll keep details to a minimum because I think that's probably for the best. But obviously, rape in prison is an issue. Abuse of power by guards towards prisoners is an issue. And that's the plotline they tried to deal with using Pennsatucky in this and the last series. I don't think it worked particularly well. I see they were going for a very, again, nuanced, trying to make every character as relatable as possible, exposition of rape in prison. I didn't like how it ultimately came down to Pennsatucky had to forgive the rapist. I was much more on her friend Boo's side in this, that he really can't really be forgiven and has to sort of be at least fired from his job. I don't know.
I think the tension, a lot of the tension, I guess, came from the idea it comes from its relationship to other, for lack of a better term, rape stories on TV shows, where what you kind of expect is for him to be a bit sorrowful, some characters to go, maybe he should be forgiven, and others to go, no, he shouldn't be forgiven, and then usually it's eventually resolved by him reoffending, and then they could just turn on him without any worry. But because he seems to, at least for now, have kept it together and not reoffended, they've just got this sort of weird relationship that's just sort of awkwardly continuing. And I'm assuming they're going somewhere with it, and, having seen this season, it could well be somewhere quite depressing.
I think, because Pennsatucky is one of my favourite characters, probably after Red and Caputo. I like the fact that in the first series, she was very much almost like the villain. She was the one who really hated Piper and was out to get her. And, she was a born-again Christian and sort of homophobic and belligerent. And she's been redeemed as a character mainly through her friendship with Boo, who's a very butch, open lesbian. The way their friendship is portrayed is so well, how they help each other out through their problems despite the fact that, they started out so far apart and they've become good friends. I really like him when they take, a character that's presented very one-dimensionally and then just add nuance and completely change how you perceive the character. But then I wasn't quite happy with how they handled the prison rape story in this one. But I still think they are trying their best to write the character well in a nuanced way.
It's a storyline where a lot of how I feel about it is going to depend on how it ends, and it appears we're not going to find out how it ends for at least a little while longer. Okay, and lastly this week, we're talking about the BBC Three slice of life sitcom Him and Her, which I recommended to Alistair last week. This is written by Stefan Goloszewski and stars Russell Tovey and Sarah Soleimani as the couple Steve and Becky, the titular Him and Her, I guess, who live together in a small flat, and indeed, the show never leaves that small flat, except in the very last season, but obviously we're nowhere near that at this point. It's very gentle and observational in a lot of ways. It focuses mostly on their sort of rambling conversations. It's in real time. It's just one of those shows about this one location, these two characters and their sort of handful of supporting casts having some sort of gentle and occasionally distasteful laughs and a few unpleasant comical misunderstandings. And yeah, it's a very good show. I'm a very big fan. I really enjoy both the comedy and the just gentle, warm feeling of Steve and Becky's genuine affection for each other. So yeah, I like it. Alistair, did you like it?
Yeah, it was very funny. It took me, I guess, a couple of episodes to get into it. At first I was a bit I'm not really sure kind of how they were pitching the humour, and then after a while I just realised it is just very funny. I think especially the second episode, I think at that point I really got into it, which builds up to a great comedic ending when basically Steve's girlfriend and all of her friends walk in on him masturbating, and it was that wasn't big or clever, but I did enjoy it. No, it's very funny, and yeah, it's a great character study. Yeah, one location, as you say, it's kind of an interesting depiction of squalor, of people in their mid-20s sometimes live in. It certainly reminded me of a house I used to live in Lancaster that was about as messy as that. They do go for the pretty, like, grim, gross out jokes. I think one of the main plots in the first episode is how Becky wants Steve to make some toast, and like he makes the toast, but then it like falls on the floor and gets all sorts of gunk on it, and he just kind of picks the gunk off and then leaves it. Then she goes, "Oh, it's my toast," and starts eating it, and he just doesn't say anything. It's filthy humour in the literal sense of the filth, although there are other sex jokes as well, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, my flat's only slightly tidier than Steve and Becky's. In fact, to be honest, it might be about the same level of mess, just better lit.
Yeah. And better wallpaper.
Well, we have paint, but I see your point. But yeah, no, I enjoyed the sort of the gentleness of it a lot. I do agree with you about the slowness, actually, because even though as I say, I recommended this to you because I'm a fan and I like it, but when rewatching the first season for series, it's a British show next series, when watching the first series for this podcast, I did find it a bit slow to get going. I think I was smirking by the second episode and in love with it again by the third or fourth episode. The third episode is the one where they're going to the fancy dress party, isn't it?
Yeah, so the third one they have to get ready for a fancy dress party.
Yes, that was glorious. I was absolutely doubled over with laughter by the time I got to that.
A lot of the humour in the show seems to be they have to do something that involves leaving the flat, and they just kind of delay and put it off and don't really go anywhere else and just kind of hang around doing nothing.
Yeah, it's always, a lot of it is based on the sort of either they building up to them leaving the flat, or occasionally they're just coming back to the flat after leaving it. And usually those are the like tenser, less fun episodes, because usually leaving the flat obviously has led to something bad happening. The series 1 finale, which I don't think you quite got to, is about them having an argument after they've made the mistake of leaving the flat. Yeah,
that seems to be, they're definitely a relationship that's very much based around staying at home together.
But yeah, it's very sweet, it's very warm, and they have a slightly sort of needly antagonising each other relationship, but it never becomes awful.
No, and it really reminded me, I think, of some like older sitcoms. You know, sitcoms I think have become, like a lot of things, the pace has become much faster, and like kind of the density of jokes has become much higher. Like if you go back and watch something like Porridge, it seems very slow paced compared to, you know, modern sitcoms, and a lot of the time a whole episode will build up just to one joke at the end, and that's kind of, rather than having jokes throughout, just a whole build up for one thing. And I felt Him and Her was more like that, especially the second episode.
But then again, the sort of the slower, no laugh track, naturalistically shot, focusing a lot on awkward situations is also quite modern. I mean, it's very Post Office in a way.
Yeah, in that sense, yeah, it's definitely right. And you know, it's very condensed. It mainly focuses basically on the relationship between these two characters. You're right. I do like how kind of loving they are towards each other, how kind of perfectly matched they are as personalities, and you know, and how they come across very human. You know, Steve's a bit jealous of her ex-boyfriend. He's anxious about meeting her parents, which is the plotline of the 5th episode. It's kind of it's good low-key. It does low-key character-based drama and humour really well, which is not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, and also, in terms of like slightly more OTT stuff, there is always Paul and Laura, two of the main supporting characters.
Yeah.
Becky's sister and her fiancé, who are usually a lot more reliable to turn up and deliver the big laugh lines. Especially Laura, who is a monster. I'd actually forgotten, because I hadn't watched an episode of this for a few years, quite how awful she is.
Yeah, Paul is pretty unrelentingly awful in that he's sort of bubbling continuously on the edge of violence.
I know, I just find that quite funny, though, to sort of over the most incredibly inane things. He's just clearly always seething with rage. He could punch the wall for almost no reason at any moment.
I think it's episode 4 when he finds out he's adopted, and he just like has a breakdown and says like he trashed his parents' house. And basically, like he's always is, you know, his adopted parents' house, and like he's just psychotic. I know he is also very emotionally manipulative, especially of Laura. He is quite unpleasant to her, and then always redeems himself by saying, "But we're so perfect together. We've got a special connection and stuff." He really does emotionally manipulate Laura quite a lot. Laura is also unpleasant, and she puts her feelings above everyone else's. Shows absolutely no form of tact and humiliates other people around her, but that doesn't mean she deserves to be emotionally manipulated by her fiancé.
I guess they are a sort of a counterpoint to the main Him and Her, in that Steve and Becky have their rough edges and their habits of feeding each other manky toast or whatever, but at least they're not those two.
Yeah, I mean, they are quite... Yeah, they're certainly a counterbalance. And if Laura wasn't so unpleasant, it would make Paul seem really bad. I don't know if that's actually necessarily true. Just because she's an unpleasant person doesn't mean she deserves to be emotionally manipulated by someone teaching her on the edge of violence. But yeah, they are, in terms of writing, they are a great counterbalance to Becky and Steve showing a dysfunctional relationship, and it shows how functional Becky and Steve's is. Even though they spend all the time just lying around in their quite messy flat and don't really do anything, it does show they do have a very close functional relationship.
Yeah, and although I did pitch this to you as a warm, uplifting experience, I had actually forgotten, how genuinely dark some of it, primarily the Paul and Dora focused bits, can occasionally be. It is not entirely an uplifting portrayal of how good the world can be.
No.
But then again, considering that I like it, that's probably not a huge surprise.
The character of Dan is also very funny. Kind of their neighbour who, lives above them and kind of shows up in the house for almost no reason. And a lot of the time just kind of refuses to leave or just hangs around way past it's become socially acceptable.
Yeah, again though, sort of a similar way to, I guess, Paul and Dora. There are elements of Dan that are, properly creepy. He is in some ways quite a unsettling individual.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, he's always played sympathetically enough or with a sort of loving edge of tolerance by the main two characters that you sort of like him anyway. Yeah,
there are some great comedy bits of him. Like I think it's in the third episode, he's just left by himself in the kind of entranceway to the flat, and it's just a extended it's probably about 3-minute sequence of him just sort of walking around, fidgeting awkwardly, messing around with various things and stuff, and it's just hilarious. Just the kind of awkward way he just kind of he just sort of fidgets when left to himself. It's very, very funny.
Yeah, but I'm glad you like it. I am a big fan of this show. It did get a bit draggy in Series 3 when they sort of seemed to slightly run out of new things to do in this situation, but then thankfully they realised and wrapped it up with Series 4, which was brilliant.
I can imagine, after about 3 series of everything taking place with only a few characters in one flat, it could stall.
It does a bit, but Series 1, 2 and 4 are amazing, and then it finishes on a high note.
I really like how base a lot of the humour is. Like, it really shows, again, it's like a really depiction of ordinary life. People will say, like, how come in 24 that, like, Jack Bauer never needs to have a poo and stuff. Well, in him and her, these characters, a lot of it's about them going to the toilet. I think pretty much reliably in every episode, one of them either takes a piss or a shit at one point or another. There's a great bit when Steve's just like on the toilet and Becky's trying to talk to him, and he just keeps saying, "I can't talk and wee" at the same time, and she keeps talking to him, and he keeps just repeating over and over, "I can't talk and wee at the same time."
Yeah, and there's a lengthy and meaningful subplot in episode 1 about how smelly Becky's last shit was. So,
yeah, exactly.
Nice.
It borders almost on the commedia dell'arte in that they are characters they have the most base motivations. They are pretty much entirely motivated by either desire for food, sex, or to go to the toilet. Seems to be the primary character motivation. So yeah,
and that in many ways is why it's one of the most realistic sitcoms on television.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, there's a sort of rambling bit in episode 6 where one of the points of Steve and Becky's weird drunken argument, I'll try not to spoil this for you in case you plan to one day watch it, but is the idea that Becky said she liked Stephen Fry whilst talking to someone in a pub, and Steve keeps complaining that Stephen Fry is actually awful, he's not good, he's just posh, how could she ever like him? And he just keeps hammering at her until she admits that she was just trying to impress someone. And it's just inane. It's great.
Yeah, it is really a show that sort of makes drama from the kind of simple interactions and the small kind of forgettable pieces of everyday life that aren't usually the subject of sitcoms or TV shows. It's great low-key writing, as I describe it. It's very low-key. It's very good.
So, Alistair, what have you got for me this fortnight?
Well, we're going to go from the low-key to the very high-key, in the sense we're going from a show that takes place entirely in one flat involving the nuances of drama between a couple to a science fiction film about the battle to save the entire world from destruction from an ancient, evil, malevolent alien force.
That could be almost any of them.
So I'm going to recommend you Luc Besson's The Fifth Element, starring Bruce Willis, Mila Jovovich, Ian Holm, Gary Oldman, and Chris Tucker. It's a great, really over-the-top action science fiction film. I really like it, and I hope you do too.
Excellent. That is yet another one of the list of classic films I should probably have seen but haven't, so I will look forward to giving that a go. Okay. And that was all the Moderate Fantasy Violence for this fortnight. If you've enjoyed this podcast, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter, where we occasionally broadcast our opinions about pop culture and stuff, or tell you more things about the podcast. We've also got the website, of course, at moderatefantasyviolence.com, where you can find the episodes, the occasional bonus essay, and in the last fortnight I also posted an extended Fantasy Violence deleted scene clip featuring one last bit of audio from Nine Worlds. In case you didn't get enough of those in the last episode, you can listen to me in my hotel room talking down the convention while my girlfriend occasionally heckles.
You can also review us on iTunes. If you've enjoyed the show, we would love it if you leave us a review. It helps us spread the word of the show to other people. I've been Alistair. You can find me on Twitter at AlistairJRBall. You can also find all my writing on redtrainblog.com.
Okay, and I've been Nick Bryan. You can find me on Twitter as @NickMB, and my blog and news of my self-published crime books at nickbryan.com. Okay, and thank you very much for listening. We will be back in a couple of weeks with a slightly underplanned episode in which we'll cover the New Divine Comedy album, obviously The Fifth Element, and probably at least one or two other things. See you then. Bye.
Bye.
That was a bit... Oh, I've never really got that from the character before, but they did bring in a lot of stuff with her kid in order to, build up why she'd suddenly go full gangster.
Yeah. I don't know, I guess there was... I don't actually have much to say about that. I don't know, I try to think of anything to say, other than I agree with you.